This is the Lido at Ruislip near London. It's hard to imagine now, but key scenes were made here for arguably the biggest British film of the 1950s. It was A Night to Remember. A Night to Remember remains the finest and most accurate film account of the Titanic disaster. And I'm here in London to talk to the film's producer, William MacQuitty, who has personal recollections of the great ship herself.
My first contact with the Titanic was in 1911, when I saw a team of 20 draft horses struggling to pull one of the great anchors through the cobbled streets of Belfast, from the foundry down to the shipyards Harvard and Woolwich. And in the shipyard, this huge mountain of a ship was rising, and I watched her rise every day. And I said to my father, how on earth can they get this huge ship into the sea? And he said, they lay the keel on the slipway, and then they build the ship on the keel. And when the day for the launching comes, they grease the slipway with tons of tallow and train oil and soap. And they give the ship a gentle push, and the ship slides down to the water. The whole of Ulster was excited. This was the biggest ship in the world. And they're all excited about the launch. And everybody in the country turned up, and all the ships in the harbor, and there's a great crowd at the launching platforms, and 3 stands were erected round. And I remember the enormous noise. Maroons went off, rockets went off, and signals were given to stand clear. And just as my father said, the chocks were knocked away, and the hydraulic rams gave the gentle push, and I didn't believe it was going to move, and it didn't move for quite a long time. And then I felt suddenly that I was moving backwards, but of course it was the ship was moving forward. And it went faster and faster, and it was pulling, they had great tons and tons of anchor chain that were attached to the ship, so that to stop it gathering too much speed. And these chains made an enormous row, and they were dragged down, and the ship went into the sea with a tremendous splash, and all the sirens and everybody, and there was great rejoicing. And I felt very proud of this, and proud also that my birthday was the 15th of May, 1905, and this ship's launch was also in May, the 31st of May. So I had a great kinship for that ship. The other kinship I had for it was that I wanted to leave Belfast. I wanted to see the world. I'd been reading the Boy's Own paper and the Wide World magazine, and the one thing I wanted to do was to see the world. And I thought if this huge ship can escape as easily as this, then a little creature like me might manage to slip through and get out into the wide open world. That is what I wanted to do. We lived at Bangor, which is 12 miles from the shipyard, and there we watched the Titanic on her trials. And she went up and down the loch, and she was so big, she made the loch look small. It was almost like a toy ship on a toy sea. And I thought again, this Belfast loch connects this ship with every sea in the world, with every country in the world, and if I can get out, boy, I'm going to see them too. And then on the 2nd of April, 1912, we watched her go out for her first voyage. The disaster affected everybody in the world, but the people in Ulster were much more affected because we all had either a friend or a relative or somebody connected with it. In 1924, I escaped from Belfast. I joined the Standard Chartered Bank, the same bank as John Major, our Prime Minister, joined. And it took me around the world. And finally, I was in Shanghai, and my mother was dying of terminal cancer, and I came home to be with her. And she died, and the war started, and I joined the Ministry of Information, and I made documentary films. But all the time, I was thinking about the Titanic and what a wonderful film this would make. The opportunity occurred when my wife, Betty, brought back Miranda, our youngest child, from Queen Charlotte's Hospital, together with a review of Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember. Now, no film can be better than its script. And here was a ready-made drama. He'd researched it for 20 years. It had everything I needed. And I took the book to the Rank organization, with whom I'd made a great many films. And the head man was John Davis. And he said, "Bill, this film is just another shipwreck. It's been made before. It's small screen, black and white. You have no stars in it. It's impossible to make this film, and it's going to be very costly." And I said, "John, this is not just another shipwreck. This is an end of an era." And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "The steerage passengers paid £12. The stateroom passengers paid £875. This is for a 5-day trip. When the ship went down, there were no lifeboats for the steerage passengers. But the first-class passengers put on evening dress to go down as gentlemen. And the order, women and children first, was, I think, interpreted inaccurately by Lightoller, who thought it was only women and children, because there's room in the boats for another 700 people. The other thing was that in the memorial to the dead in the Titanic in 1912 lies alongside the War Memorial in Belfast City Hall. And in the Titanic Memorial, the names are in order of importance. But in the War Memorial, they're in alphabetical order. It was an end of an era of arrogance, and it's a very important piece of filming.
This is New York City, and I'm here to interview Walter Lord, the author of the original book, A Night to Remember.
I wish I knew how my interest in the Titanic began. I really have no idea. I just have always been interested in it. I think it's, when I was 9 years old, I was interested in the Titanic. I think perhaps it has something to do with the way little boys catch cold. Nobody knows how they do it, they just do. I think the same thing with my interest in the Titanic. I had finished a book on our Civil War, and I was looking for another project. I thought perhaps about the Civil War again. And my editor, who was a chap I'd worked with in OSS in London, said, again, you were always talking about the Titanic, why don't you write a book about it? So I began doing it, but I had done most of the research just to satisfy my own curiosity. When I went to Princeton, other people went to the library to study the classics or French or something, that I went to the library to look at the old newspapers on the Titanic. I also found the hearings there, the American hearings, and that's such a wonderful, unexplored treasury of material on the ship that I gobbled that up too while I was at it. And then I was pretty much ready to write about the subject whenever it happened. I was ready without knowing it. I worked out my outline of my book, chapter by chapter. I then wrote a draft, and then the time my editor felt was that was the time to get in touch with the survivors, when I knew as much as I was ever going to know without them. And so I began a sort of blitzkrieg of getting in touch with survivors. And it was difficult in a way because there was no Survivors Association at the time. There was no Titanic Club. There was no Titanic interest, really. But nothing had been written on it for 40 years, not since 1913. And so it was a challenge just to find them. And I didn't have much money. I worked in the advertising business at the time. I was a writer. My solution was to write letters to the editor and ask editors of various newspapers to place these letters in their letters column. And I tried to pick the cities where there might be most survivors from what I knew. For instance, Chicago was a place where a lot of them were going who were going to settle in the middle west of our country. New York was an obvious place. Some of the most prominent came from Philadelphia, so that was another place. Then there were the Belfast papers. Of course, she was built in Belfast. And then there were the London papers, the British papers. And then, of course, the Southampton Echo and those coastal papers. I sent barrels of these letters out, each of them informal and personal, not just a form mimeographed letter. I sent them a personal letter to the editor and asked them whether they would run it. And an amazing number did. And then the survivors, the letters said to get in touch with me at my New York address, and then they began writing in. And then, of course, once you got a few of them, they would lead to others. And in the end, I had over 64, I think. But that was the way it was done. And on a very low budget of just a number of postage stamps, I managed to get in a very rich harvest of Titanic survivors. It just came to me. I can even show you the spot in the city of New York where inspiration suddenly came to me. This book should be called A Night to Remember. It was at the corner of 38th Street and Park Avenue, if you don't want to go there. There were certain people in the publishing business, however, who thought that all you've got to write about is the Titanic. How can you not put the Titanic on the cover? The Night to Remember that was published here it has a picture of the ship on the cover. It doesn't explain who she is. It's just running right at the iceberg. In Britain, they weren't as brave. Longmans Green, who did a beautiful job of publishing it and promoting it, nevertheless on the jacket, they call it A Night to Remember, and there's no subtitle or anything, but there is a life ring which says Titanic on the life ring, which is going down into the sea. So they got around my prohibition that way. Well, the book was a success beyond my wildest dreams. I was still working full-time in the advertising business, had a job in the day from 9 to 5, and it was a funny concatenation of events there, because I would be working nothing is lower than a writer in the advertising business. The representatives and the executives and so on are all people who deal with the client, but never the writer. He just sits, poor ink-stained wretch, and works on his ads. So I would be working that sort of 9 to 5 existence in a very fine company, but nevertheless working in a mundane, humble way. And then at 5, because the book had caught on so much, I'd go to the television studio. It was sort of a double life. It was like sort of a Walter Mitty existence for a while. Finally, I went on to other things, but nevertheless, it was a very interesting life to be on a bit of our big television shows. One minute, the next minute, sitting sort of sweeping out the corner of the closets in the advertising agency. Here we are, and it's in its 55th paperback printing. Then there are editions all over the world. For a while, I collected them all, and I have a dozen or more, and they're fun to keep, and I proudly put them up on the shelf of my bookcase. But it interests me that so many people in so many places have become interested in this subject. The the editions are in every language you could possibly think of. Not long ago, somebody sent me 9 copies of the Pakistani edition. Well, I wish I had 9 Pakistani friends, but they just sit on the shelf as it is.
I'm frequently asked what the producer's job is in a film. It's frequently confused with the director. The producer's job is to find the best story, to get the best scriptwriter, to get the best director, to get the best cameraman, and to get the best art director. And in all these things, I was very successful. Eric Ambler wrote the script. Roy Baker, a splendid director, directed the film. Jeffrey Unsworth was the cameraman, first class. And Alexandra Wodzinski, known as Vetch, was certainly the best construction and art director in the business. And I was lucky to get them all. They were all overtaken, I think, by the brilliance of Walter's book and by the script with Eric Ambler. These were 2 top people. I mean, you can't do better than the script.
I heard about it first from my editor, Howard Cady, who said, we've gotten an offer for a film deal, and from a British producer, and he seems pretty respectable. And I said, well, of course I'd like that. And I also said I'd like to work on it if I could get it into that. And so Howard got the word to Bill MacQuitty. Bill MacQuitty got the word back, sure, come on over. I was so lucky. Bill was really interested in the Titanic. He had seen it launched when he was a 5 or 6 year old at Ulster and vaguely remembered it. And so he really adopted the project as his own and was there all the time. The thing that interested me the most was how earnest he was in getting it absolutely accurate as far as he could. The sets of the various public rooms are based and modeled after what details could be found of the actual rooms on the Titanic. The clothes and even the casting of the characters he just put a great deal of effort into it, particularly having the ship look the way the ship did. He used about 5 different areas for the ship. He had a model, and he had a real ocean liner that was being dismantled in northern England, and he had sets that were built, and he just was very thorough about it.
One of the things I had to do was to build the center section of the ship. That included 4 lifeboats and 2 funnels. And Vetch did this. It took 4,000 tons of steel to build this on a great concrete apron, which is still a monument to A Night to Remember at Pinewood Studios. This deck angle of the ship was slightly angled so that by altering the camera, we could get a level deck or double the degree of angle. And each page of the script, I had the angle put in because we don't shoot in chronological order. And one of my problems was lowering the lifeboats into the water. And this I had arranged with the Shaw-Saville line. But the Shaw-Saville line at the 11th hour pulled out of the idea. I think sinking ships was bad for business. No other shipping line would handle it. I took a plane and went up to the Clyde, and at the yards of W.D. Ward, they were breaking up the Asturias, which is on the Australian run and painted white. The port side had been demolished, but the starboard side was okay, and it was floating, and it had the same davits. I got the lifeboats from the Franconia, which was Churchill's secret headquarters at Yalta at the conference. And this went extremely well. I told Ward I was afraid they would try to stop me, and I'd like a contract. And I said, how much will you charge me for 10 nights on the starboard side and not interfering with any of your work? And I think he was quite enthusiastic about the film. He charged me £100 and I got his receipt, and the next day the P&O told him to have nothing whatever to do with MacQuitty, but it was too late. It was painted white, but we got the students of Glasgow University to paint it in the White Star colours. Both sides of the ship were shown with the aid of mirrors and by using mirror writer for the name Titanic where it was visible. In the background, several battleships, including King George V, wait their turn for breaking. Here we see Roy Baker with cameraman Geoffrey Unsworth discussing the filming, which included all the long jumps from the deck into the water. Now these people were professionals and they charged £1 a foot, and this was 80 quid a go. And they were wearing these cork life jackets. Now the cork life jacket went down to not nearly your knees, and if they jumped in those, it would have hit up and knocked their heads off. So I managed to stop the first one and got kapok life jackets built in the same way. And in these they jumped quite safely. The next sequence was shot at Ruislip Reservoir near Pinewood Studios, where the rest of the picture was filmed. Well, I was very lucky. I shot this film between November, December, January, February, and we got some very cold weather because it was essential to show the breath of the people in the air. I couldn't have shot it in the summer and shown their breath, so nature was on my side. The passengers, once they got dunked and wet, when we wanted to reshoot, we put them through a hot room, which was very hot, and they were glad to get back into the cold water. I couldn't afford time or money, really, to have several period costumes for each passenger. The hot room did the trick. Kenny had a wetsuit. He didn't have to leave the set. He had a white sweater. Underneath this was a frogman suit, so he was warm. Actors are very sensible about things like that. They work it out.
It could be done on a lake to have the people swimming around in the water in the shots just after the ship went down. And it could be done accurately in a lake because the Atlantic was so smooth, it was like a lake that night. In fact, it's one of the reasons that the accident happened was because there was no wind at all, nothing to kick up a little surf on the base of an iceberg. So that the actual facts played right into the dramatist's hands by having a sea that was as calm as a lake in England.
The lifeboats were identical with those of the Titanic, and I was fortunate to have the services of Captain Grattage, who was captain of the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, and who had joined the Cunard Line in 1914. Joseph Boxall, fourth officer of the Titanic, was also my technical advisor throughout the picture.
On filming, they were extremely lucky in the weather because it was cold when the Titanic went down at night, and it was cold when they were filming the show based on the book. Little things like the breath that steams out from you when it's very cold came across so well. You couldn't watch that film without thinking that it was bitterly cold. The water was lake-like, which I have mentioned to you. It was, again, just the way it was. The ocean was like a mill pond, and they practically filmed it in a mill pond, as it were. In the film, there is a moment when a collapsible boat floats off from the sinking Titanic, floats off upside down. And this, in fact, actually happened that night, and you can see it in the film. The survivors in the water or people who were thrown into the water, tried to get to this collapsible and did. But finally, when they had about 25 or 30 aboard on the bottom of this boat, when more people came and tried to get on, there was some very sad scenes where they were kept from getting on. And it was understandable because one more person on board that boat would have upset them all. But this comes off, I think, very effectively in the film, and it proves, if nothing else, something that I wondered whether 25 or 30 people could really get on the bottom of an upside-down boat without doing damage, upsetting them all. It proved that you could get that many people on the boat because that's what they did. And so it was a scene that gained its authenticity from the film rather than had to try for authenticity. It contributed authenticity to the picture to have this film that on the boat that was upside down.
Edith Russell and Lawrence Beasley, whom we see here, also were most helpful with advice on various shots, as were the other survivors. We see the cameraman Geoffrey Unsworth and the lifeboat containing the unsinkable Molly Brown.
These sequences of invaluable behind-the-scenes footage remain in the same chronological order as William MacQuitty himself filmed them. We're witnessing 5 months of intensive production work in the order it happened, and will frequently switch between interior studio scenes, as here, to various exterior locations, and later to the special effects department. It gives an insight into the many and varied aspects of large-scale feature film production at this time.
Kenneth Moore talks to Mrs. Lightholler, wife of Second Officer Lightholler. Joseph Boxall, my technical advisor, seen here once more on the deck of the Titanic. Boxall was walking on her deck when she struck the iceberg, but the impact was so slight that it did not even alter his stride.